Gibberish, China's economy too strong to disintegrate. Many analysts are speculating about the demise of China's economy, which is currently the second largest economy in the world by nominal GDP. A continuous stream of pundits proclaiming China's economy is on the verge of total collapse, and almost everyone seems to be predicting doom and gloom for China's economic future. However, like most things in life, there are many sides to every story, and the truth lies somewhere in the middle. There is no doubt China is facing some severe economic problems today. But make no mistake about it, China is an economic powerhouse and will continue to be for the foreseeable future. Anyone living outside of China who has any knowledge about the country knows it is not at all easy to predict what will happen in the next couple of years. But China is here to stay until they are taken out of the way. Hello and welcome to another video of Finance Sense, where we cover all the latest trends in the financial markets and the economy. This video aims to shed some light on the contemporary situation of China's economy and give you an insight into whether it is actually heading towards a total collapse, a Great Depression. But before we start, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and comment below if you enjoyed watching this video, and turn on the notification bell to keep posted. Now, without further ado, let's head on to the video. We frequently see videos talking about the impending collapse of China here and there. However, China is not expected to experience a total collapse or Great Depression for two reasons. First, China's political system is not similar to that of the United States even before Great Depression. Second, China's economy is very different from other Asian economies that are obviously in a crisis, like Sri Lanka. At first glance, the situation in China resembles the collapse of the American financial system in the early 1930s and 2008s. The two financial crises that occurred had such devastating effects on the economy that they were known as the Great Depression and the Great Recession, respectively. The Great Depression's history begins with a massive increase in bank lending and asset prices, particularly in the stock market. Similar to this, the history of the Great Recession begins with soaring credit expansion coupled with massive asset price increases, primarily in real estate and stocks. This scenario so far is quite similar to China's. Property prices saw a sharp increase in 2009 as a result of a lending spree by Chinese banks and other financial institutions. As a result, Chinese cities like Shenzhen and Shanghai will be 4 times more expensive in 2020 than a city like New York relative to income. However, it is evident that asset prices cannot continue to increase compared to the size of the economy. Therefore, asset values have to decline in each of the three situations. The banks that provided loans secured by these assets started collapsing in all three scenarios. People began to demand the banks their money back since they were unsure of whether or not their money was secure. But this is not possible in any modern system of banking. Therefore, people sought to be the first to withdraw their money from the banking system in all three situations, which led to a bank run. China is now in this situation, which is also when the Great Recession and the Great Depression began to diverge. Meanwhile, the bubble in China differs from that in the United States. The American Central Bank essentially allowed the financial sector to collapse during the Great Depression. It also makes perfect sense to let any typical business collapse when it runs into problems. The issue is that banks serve as a system for facilitating both credit creation and payments for the whole economy. Therefore, having them collapse is similar to letting all of your electricity providers fail at once. From a moral standpoint, it could be acceptable, but in the process, you destroy your entire economy. In the US, it took 10 years for the economy to recover. But in the midst of the Great Recession, the Federal Reserve Bank did end up saving the financial system after witnessing the damage caused by the failure of the Lehman Brothers Bank. However, the US was able to escape a second Great Depression and instead had a Great Recession that was much milder. China's situation differs from the Great Depression and the Great Recession because, like during the Great Recession, its central bank is well aware of the risks involved with allowing your economy's credit and monetary system to collapse in an effort to instill a lesson in people. Also, there are two other ways in which China's situation differs from that of the Great Recession. First, most of its banks are already owned by the government. A rush to get paper money from these institutions would be ineffective, as China's central bank is well equipped to do so. Second, unlike American politicians who waited until the bubble burst on its own, the Chinese government burst the bubble, particularly when it launched its policy of the 3 red lines that demanded bad property developers begin deleveraging. In conclusion, China's economy won't implode like the one in the United States, because it has learned a valuable lesson from the American Great Depression. In addition, China's crisis won't be as bad as a Great Recession. The reason is that the Chinese government places a higher importance on stability than the American government. China will therefore make more determined efforts to spend its way out of problems. However, you can argue at this point and claim that since the United States issues the world reserve currency, you cannot compare China to the United States. Because the US is essentially funded by other nations that are in dire need of dollars, it has greater room to spend its way out of problems. Furthermore, one significant aspect of China's current problems is that international investors appear to be leaving the nation in large numbers. As a result, perhaps, it should not be compared to the United States but to other Asian economies like Sri Lanka, which is currently collapsing due to inflation. Well, no, and here are the reasons why. China, unlike Sri Lanka, has attained monetary independence, which explains why it can preserve its banking system if it wants to. And there are 2 ways it has done so. Emerging into superpower in manufacturing was the first way. According to the most recent numbers, China accounts for 1/5 of global manufacturing output. Therefore, China's continuous trade surplus with the rest of the world is not surprising. China's trade surplus has even reached record highs as its economy slows and imports less. In other words, the global market needs Chinese goods. As a result, while not issuing the reserve currency, the central bank has a mountain of US dollars. Therefore, it may use these to defend the currency and simply offset the impact of fleeing foreign investors. This will aid in preventing a collapse similar to that in Sri Lanka. A trade surplus alone, however, is insufficient, as we witnessed in February when the Russian ruble completely collapsed. The issue for Russia at the time was that while a lot of dollars were flowing into the central bank's coffers through exports, Russians were frantically trying to leave the country with even more money. The same thing happened in Turkey, where individuals sold their liras to purchase gold, cryptocurrencies, and dollars because they didn't trust their government. Moreover, capital controls is also the second way China has gained monetary independence. In essence, capital controls implies making it very difficult for money to cross international boundaries. Furthermore, because the Chinese government forbids citizens from moving money out of the nation, it is extremely difficult to move money out of China. Russia began pursuing a similar course of action in response to Western sanctions. And it's apparent that this enabled Russia to save its currency and prevent a collapse similar to Sri Lanka. However, China won't fall apart since it has attained monetary independence and probably learned from the Great Depression in the United States. The more likely scenario is a short recession, a government intervention, and then a prolonged period of stagnation or steady decline, similar to Japan. I'm afraid we have reached the end of the video for today. Thank you for watching this far. Please subscribe and give a like if you enjoyed it, and comment your thoughts below. This is Finance Sense, helping you keep up with all the latest trends in the financial markets and the economy. See you in the next video.